Hi everyone, welcome again, and we are going to be starting on chapter 26 of America's Story 2, and this chapter is entitled Big Changes. When everything is beginning to look bleak and hopeless, there are always those who rise up to make a difference. Sometimes it takes only one person to stand up and start making a difference. That's what the heroes of this chapter did. Poverty in the 19th century. The poor in major cities across America lived in squalid conditions. A considerable amount of media attention was focused on urban poverty. Photographs of the conditions they lived in horrified readers, but also sparked debate as to how to solve the problem and help raise the awareness of the issue facing people who lived in tenements and slums. America has always struggled with finding the balance of people control versus government control. A study of our government and how it was originally set up will show that the Founding Fathers understood this was going to be a struggle. By reading original documents, you can see there are built-in safety measures. Through the years, these safety measures have been changed and sometimes completely removed. To completely understand, you'll need to study government and civics in a more in-depth way than we can do in this book. In just a little more than 100 years, our country has grown in unimaginable ways. After we won our freedom from England, we had to figure out what kind of government we wanted. How could we set up a government that was for the people and by the people? Nobody wanted to replace the tyranny of the English government with more tyranny from an American government. We have learned that our country was founded on principles that are unique to our country. With every new challenge, Americans came together to find solutions. Of course, with so many different kinds of people, there are bound to be disagreements on how to solve rising issues. We learned in our last chapter about how there were troubles between the classes of people. We learned about those who wanted to keep certain immigrants out of the country. Not all of the upper class, old American families were frightened or intimidated by the swarms of these new immigrants, though. They didn't blame the newcomers for the country's problems. These people's opposition to this way of thinking served as the voice of reason and truth for the rest of the country. They said it was not the newcomers who had built the terribly designed tenement house slums, and it wasn't the newcomers who were in Congress or the Senate. No, the problem lay how there were no new laws to protect workers or deal with the overcrowding situation or the unfair treatment of children. In this chapter, we're going to learn about a few remarkable Americans who stepped out of their comfort zone and their class to help reform the country. Have you ever heard of the name William Wilberforce? Wilberforce was a spoiled rich boy who put aside everything of material worth to step forward to fight slavery in England in the early 1800s. I'm going to tell you the story of another such person. This is a young woman named Jane Addams. Miss Addams was sickly as a child, having contracted tuberculosis of the spine. This illness left her weak and tired most of the time. Miss Addams came from a wealthy family who was able to send her to the finest boarding schools in the country. As a young woman, Jane traveled to Europe, like most young people of her status did. It was one of these jaunts to Europe that Jane realized she was tired of wasting her life and her family's money. She felt convicted of being self-centered. Jane wanted to be more in touch with those who were less fortunate than she. While in London, Miss Addams visited Tonbridge Hall. She watched in awe as groups of upper-class university graduates spent their time helping the people of the worst neighborhoods in London. Jane was inspired and resolved to do the same thing in America. On her voyage home, Jane made a plan of action. It was really quite simple. She would go to the most terrible neighborhood in the lowest class slum that she could find. There she would start her own version of the Tonbridge Hall. This settlement house would be a haven to the people of that neighborhood and the surrounding area. Jane had a plan to gather many of her well-educated friends to work in the settlement house. They would teach the young girls to sew and cook, and the boys to excel in usable life skills and sports. Soon the whole house was inspiring people all over the nation. Jane had a plan. Settlement houses were starting all over the country's biggest and poorest cities. They offered art, drama, and libraries of books to the poorest of the poor. Suddenly, the poor immigrants felt that someone did care after all. The havens of help did not offer handouts. They offered a hand up. Instead of giving them only food and sustenance, they were given help to acquire the skills to obtain what they needed on their own, which is very good. There is a big difference. How old are you? Well, I know the answer to that question. Most of you, pretty young. Growing up, though. Growing fast. Can you imagine having a job at a factory? What if I told you that your work hours were about 14 hours a day? 6 days a week. Now add to that picture that you work in a factory that only has one wood stove in the center of a large workroom. Your workstation is more than 30 feet away from that stove, and your fingers are so cold you can't feel them. This is what almost 2 million children under the age of 16, which all of you are, lived with by the 1890s. Children worked in mines, factories, and mills. They worked long hours for very little pay, and much of the work was very dangerous. I think the best way we can envision the working conditions for these children in this time is do a little time traveling. I have to warn you, though, this is not going to be a pleasure trip. The weather we are going to is quite nippy, so make sure you have your stocking cap and a pair of mittens. Zip up your coat and grab a hold of my hand. We're heading back to the year 1892 to a clothing mill in Chicago, Illinois. We're on a gray street in front of a gray building, standing tall and dark against a lighter gray sky. People brush past us without even looking up. A cold north wind howls, and we shiver as we climb the 3 steps up to the front door. It will feel good to get inside. As we push through the doors, the expected rush of warm air does not meet us. In fact, it feels just as cold in here as it does outside. The only thing missing is the wind. As our eyes adjust to the dimness of the room, we see the room is full of sewing machines, lined up in rows of 15 or 20. Crouching over the machines are children. We look at each other with wide eyes. These children are no older than you are. In fact, quite a few of them look younger. Many of the children are not wearing warm enough clothing. We watch in horror as the slouching form of the supervisor walks between the machines, stopping occasionally to point and growl in disapproval of a child's work. This man is obviously not very kind to these children, for he gives a resounding rap against the cold knuckles of a small girl who must have missed a stitch. We decide to stay out of the way and move over to the wall. It is all we can do to not jump in on the children's behalf. The little girl tries to blink back the tears, but one spills over, making a trail down her dirty cheek. She angrily rubs it away with the back of her even dirtier hand. As we study the faces of the children in front of us, we see exhaustion, hunger, and fear. How could this be happening right here in America? Why would people think that it's acceptable to treat children like this? Our hearts are sad as we turn to leave the factory. How many children are sitting in factories like this one all over the country? We are so glad to know that there are people working to bring an end to this type of abuse. Child labor was being scrutinized and protested by many people. One of these people was an Irish immigrant lady named Mary Harris Jones. Mrs. Jones lost her entire family in a yellow fever epidemic. This tough little lady supported herself by working as a seamstress in Chicago. But again, Mary Jones lost everything she had. This time, it was the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 that took all her belongings, including her livelihood. Mary Jones wasn't going to let this keep her down, though. She became known as Mother Jones, as she worked tirelessly to help those around her. She became a labor organizer and outspoken advocate for children. In 1903, Mary led a group of children on a march starting in Pennsylvania and ending in New York City. The purpose of the march was to call attention to the plight of these poor working children. Mary wanted to gain the support to pass child labor laws. The March of the Mill Children, as it came to be called, did help move the country in the right direction, but child labor would remain a problem for quite some time. And the word of the chapter is Settlement House, an organization that offered support and enrichment for residents of poor neighborhoods. Settlement House. March of the Mill Children. Mother Jones led a march against child labor in 1903. They marched from Philadelphia, which had thousands of child laborers in textile factories, to New York City to President Theodore Roosevelt's home. The number of her marchers varied, because not all of them were in good enough shape to make the whole trip. The journey took 3 weeks, and along the way they stopped in numerous other cities that had large number of factories and industrial workers. Mother Jones gave speeches at their stops. Sometimes the marchers were greeted sympathetically, and other times they were not, though they were sheltered and fed along the way by supporters. Initially, her request to march into New York City was denied, but she was so persuasive that she convinced the mayor to let her come on. Her wish to meet with President Roosevelt was not granted, but the march generated a lot of publicity and helped to lead to the reform of child labor laws. Housing and poverty reform. Charles Loring Brace founded one of the first organizations to help poor children in the United States, the Children's Aid Society. It is still in operation today. Danish-born journalist and photographer Jacob Riis called attention to the difficulties of tenement life with his work. He had lived in the slums when he first came to America. Reformers also fought the practice of allowing people to do factory work from home. They argued it was unfair to the entire family, and especially the children who had to work too. There were multiple legislation bills to improve tenements. The first one in 1867 required fire escapes, windows, and bathroom facilities. The first settlement house in the United States was opened in New York City by Stanton Coit. Like Jane Addams, he was inspired by Tonby Hall in London. Industrial schools were opened to give poor orphans in the cities an education and a trade. Before, many of these children would have been living on the street. The most important tenement reform law came in 1901. It called for improved housing, but also ensured that the laws were enforced. A second tenement housing reform bill in 1879, required windows to be open to natural sunlight. Before then, tenements would feature windows that opened into other rooms. Child labor laws are an extremely important part of our culture. Discuss with your parent or teacher what inhumane and unkind business practices were ended with the coming of these laws. How have they changed the way the world looks at children? Something that may be interesting to know. It was around this time, with the common mistreatment of poor children, that there were authors who called attention to the plight of these underprivileged young ones. Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist during this time. Also during this time, a British educator by the name of Charlotte Mason stepped forward to do what she could with the lack of true education being given to children. She encouraged the teachers she trained to embrace the child as a whole person, wholly and completely loved by their Creator. So, don't forget to keep on working on your workbooks, and I hope you enjoyed the lesson for today.